When I asked my parents if I could come along to the family retreat this year, they hesitated. Then came the excuse. There won't be enough space this time, sweetheart. We're keeping it small, just the core family. I remember staring at the phone screen, heart pounding. Core family. I was their daughter, and somehow, I still didn't make the cut. I told them it was fine, that I understood, but I didn't. I cried in the shower that night. It wasn't just about missing the trip. It was about being excluded from something that used to be sacred. The message was loud and clear. I no longer belonged. I spent that weekend in the city, trying to distract myself. That's when Jake called. He was my best friend's husband. We'd known each other for 5 years. He and Naomi had this vibrant, wild love story that I used to envy. But over the past year, Naomi had grown more distant from both of us, busy with the baby, tired, emotionally unavailable. Jake and I started talking more, first about her, then about ourselves. That weekend, I told him everything about my parents, the rejection, how small I felt, and he listened, really listened. It was the first time in months someone made me feel like I mattered. We met for dinner. 1 drink turned into 4. He walked me home, and the kiss just happened soft, almost hesitant, but deliberate. I wish I could say that was it, but it wasn't. It became a pattern. Every few weeks, sometimes more, we didn't even call it anything. It was this hidden space where we both felt less invisible. When he held me, I felt like I wasn't just someone's afterthought. I felt real. But the guilt never left. I watched Naomi post photos of their baby, smiling, radiant while I carried her betrayal like a shadow. Jake tried to justify it. We're both neglected. This is survival. But that felt hollow. Months passed, and I started changing, paranoid, cold, detached. My relationships thinned. Even my work suffered. Then one night, Naomi found our texts. She didn't confront me at first, just disappeared. Jake told me she took the baby and went to her sister's. A week later, I got a single message from her. You were supposed to be my sister. Jake tried calling, but I didn't answer. I was done, not out of virtue, but exhaustion. That affair didn't fill the space left by my parents, it created a deeper one inside me. And the worst part, I never really loved Jake. I loved the way he made me feel, chosen, wanted, but it came at the cost of everything else. Eventually, my parents reached out again, small talk, invitations, but never an apology. I said yes once, just to see, and even when I stood in that mountain cabin again, surrounded by siblings, laughter, and wine, I still felt that space. That quiet void only I could feel. I learned something in all of this. Emotional abandonment doesn't justify betrayal, but it explains it. I wasn't evil. I was just starving for love, for validation, for connection. And sometimes when you're starving long enough, you'll eat whatever you're given, even poison. That family retreat didn't have space for me. But eventually, I made space in myself to grow, to heal, to sit with the shame and let it teach me, not define me. And that is how I began again. It began with a message that seemed harmless at first glance, but it carried a weight I couldn't shake. My parents texted me to say there wouldn't be enough space at the cabin for the family retreat this year. They said it gently, almost rehearsed we're keeping it small this time, just your brothers, their kids, and a couple of friends. A couple of friends. But not me. I stared at the message for minutes, then hours later I stared at it again, hoping I had read it wrong. I didn't want to believe they were pushing me out. I tried to rationalize it, maybe it was genuinely crowded, maybe it wasn't intentional. But beneath all that logic was a familiar ache, one that had been with me since I moved out and became the daughter who didn't call as much, didn't follow the expected path, didn't marry, didn't give them grandkids. Over time, I started noticing the spaces I used to fill were quietly being given to others. My room at the cabin became a storage space. My photos were fewer in the family albums. I was loved, yes, but from a distance, the kind of love that doesn't make room. Being told there was no space wasn't new, it was just the first time they said it out loud. I sat on my couch that night with a glass of wine, scrolling through social media while my brothers' wives shared pictures of the packing process. Matching pajama sets, cabin snacks, piles of board games. I wasn't even tagged. My heart felt like it was shrinking inside my chest. It wasn't just exclusion, it was invisibility. When your own family treats you like an afterthought, the effect is quiet, but corrosive. You start to doubt your place in every room. You question your worth before anyone else gets the chance to. The worst part, you try to act like it doesn't bother you. You tell yourself you're independent, mature, above needing their validation. But inside, you're still that little girl watching the door, waiting to be invited back in. I didn't cry that night. Not right away. Instead, I cleaned my apartment obsessively. I replied to emails. I answered texts I'd ignored for days. It's funny how heartbreak doesn't always arrive as sobbing. Sometimes it arrives as productivity, a quiet scramble to control something, anything. I kept telling myself I'd plan my own weekend, go somewhere alone, treat myself, but the silence was loud, and no spa treatment could erase the fact that I had been excluded by the people who were supposed to know me best. A few days later, my mom sent a casual group photo from the cabin. Everyone was in it. Everyone except me. That's when the tears came, not as a flood, but in soft, stinging waves I couldn't stop. I wasn't just excluded from a vacation. I was being shown again that in this family, I didn't quite belong anymore. The retreat had always been sacred to me. As a child, it was the one time each year when the world felt safe. Dad would cook outside, Mom would play music from the 70s, and my brothers and I would swim until our lips turned blue. It was where we laughed the hardest and fought the loudest. It was home, so being left out of it didn't feel like a scheduling issue. It felt like a quiet declaration. You're no longer part of the inner circle. That ache became something deeper, heavier. I stopped replying to family messages. I skipped a few birthday calls. Not out of revenge, I just didn't have the emotional energy to pretend everything was fine. I kept asking myself why this hurt so much. I was grown, I had friends, a job, a life. But the truth is, family rejection is different. It reopens wounds you didn't even realize were still bleeding. And when you're already carrying the weight of feeling unseen, unchosen, unneeded, one more act of emotional abandonment becomes the thing that breaks the dam. That weekend, while my family toasted marshmallows in the woods, I sat alone in my apartment, not just lonely, but hollow. And somewhere in that silence, the part of me that had been screaming to be loved began quietly looking elsewhere, not for revenge, not even for attention, just for someone who would make me feel like I mattered again. That was the emotional storm I was in when Jake reached out. And without realizing it, I began stepping into something that would change everything. Jake messaged me the night after the family retreat photos were posted. It was almost 11 p.m., just a simple, "Hey, you okay? Saw the pictures. Looked like it would have been your kind of thing." That message felt like a match flicking on in a dark room. I hadn't heard from anyone else who noticed my absence, not even my mom after the trip ended. But Jake did. He always noticed little things. Maybe that's why I answered so quickly. Maybe that's why I told him the truth when he asked if I was okay. I wasn't. I felt invisible. And strangely, I didn't need to explain it to him. He already understood. We talked for 2 hours that night. Not about anything romantic, just life. His frustrations with work, how Naomi had been distant lately, always tired, how they barely had a real conversation anymore that didn't involve diapers or bills. I didn't judge, I just listened, because I knew what that kind of silence did to a person. When someone who once made you feel seen stops looking, you start looking elsewhere. We both were. We didn't say it out loud, but it was there hanging between us. Two people quietly aching for connection. What started as one conversation became a pattern. A message after dinner, a call during a walk, a meme sent during a work break. He wasn't flirting, at least not overtly. He was just present, curious about my day, my thoughts, my feelings. It felt harmless at first, like we were just filling each other's emotional gaps. But it was more than that. I found myself dressing up even when I wasn't leaving the house, just in case we FaceTimed. I'd scroll back through our texts, rereading the parts where he said I was funny or insightful. Those words felt like sunlight after a long winter. One night, after a particularly rough conversation with my mom, I called him without thinking. He answered right away, even though it was nearly midnight. I told him everything, how they made me feel like an outsider, how I couldn't stop wondering what I'd done wrong, how tired I was of feeling like I had to earn a place in people's lives. He listened in a way that made me feel held, not physically, but emotionally. It's a kind of intimacy that sneaks up on you. You don't see the line until you've already crossed it. A week later, we met for coffee. Just coffee, neutral territory, but even in public, something had shifted. His eyes lingered longer. His laugh was softer, warmer. When we hugged goodbye, it lasted a second too long. I told myself it was nothing, but that was a lie I wanted to believe, because the truth was more complicated. The truth was that I liked how he made me feel seen, chosen, important. And he liked how I listened, how I never judged, how I made space for him in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. The first time we kissed, it wasn't passionate. It was quiet, almost shy. We were sitting in his car after dinner, talking about how heavy things had been at home. He said, "I don't feel like myself anymore." I reached over, touched his hand, and then it just happened. No build-up, no dramatic music, just lips meeting in a moment of mutual understanding. When we pulled apart, neither of us said anything. There was nothing to say. It wasn't planned. But it also wasn't an accident. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, guilt curling in my stomach like smoke. I didn't sleep. I kept thinking of Naomi, of what she would feel if she knew. I wasn't the type to do this. I wasn't. But I was also no longer the type who got invited to family retreats or remembered in group texts. I was the type who sat alone on weekends, who ached quietly and tried to patch her wounds with productivity. Jake wasn't the solution, but he was the salve, and in that moment, I clung to it. Over the next few weeks, we met more often, never with any grand plan, just lunches that turned into walks, walks that turned into hours parked somewhere talking. And sometimes kissing. It didn't feel like cheating, not then. It felt like two people borrowing moments of oxygen in lives that were suffocating. We never talked about what we were doing. We didn't define it. That would have made it real, and real meant consequences. But even as I tried to compartmentalize it, I could feel the guilt seeping into everything. I'd look at Naomi's Instagram stories, her smile, their child, and feel like I was standing outside someone else's life, breaking windows just to feel something. And still, I didn't stop, because when you've been made to feel like you don't belong, even stolen affection feels like home. And home is hard to walk away from, especially when it's the only place you've felt anything real in a long, long time. The affair didn't explode, it unraveled, quietly, almost imperceptibly at first. What began as stolen moments and soft justifications became a maze of tangled emotions and lies that I could no longer control. I remember the shift. It wasn't a dramatic discovery or a slammed door. It was a text I almost forgot to delete. A message that was just a little too warm for a friend. That's when the fear began to sink in. Not fear of getting caught, but fear of what I was becoming, someone who had built her sense of self, worth around a secret that was starting to rot everything it touched. I began to notice how carefully I was curating every part of my day, turning off notifications when Naomi was nearby, creating excuses to not attend gatherings, declining FaceTimes. My phone was always flipped over, always locked. I didn't just lie to Naomi, I lied to myself. Told myself it wasn't serious, that it was just emotional. But it wasn't. There were nights I went to bed with his voice in my ear, not hers. I was investing more of my heart into borrowed moments than I was in any real part of my life. And with every kiss, every conversation, I was walking further away from who I used to be, a woman who once had lines she thought she'd never cross. The guilt showed up everywhere. I couldn't look Naomi in the eyes for too long. I started avoiding her hugs, brushing off plans, flinching when she mentioned Jake casually in conversation. She would vent about their distance, and I would nod and pretend like I didn't know exactly where he had been during those late-night absences. She'd ask if I thought he still loved her, and I'd feel my throat tighten. How do you lie to someone who trusts you like a sister? The answer is, slowly, painfully, with a smile that starts to crack at the corners. Jake, on the other hand, was changing too. He wasn't always calm anymore. He became distracted, agitated, and sometimes silent for days. The fantasy we had created, that soft, safe space outside our broken lives, began to blur. The consequences were catching up, and neither of us was equipped to handle them. He started to pull away, emotionally first, then physically. Said he needed time to think. Said the pressure was becoming too much. I said I understood, but inside I was unraveling. I had risked so much, poured so much of myself into something that was never really mine, and now he was folding in on himself. I started to feel that old abandonment again, the one I felt when my parents told me there wasn't space for me at the cabin. It was the same ache, just disguised differently. I was losing him, the way I'd felt I lost them. I had tried to fill one emotional wound with another, and now I was bleeding from both. It was exhausting to keep lying, to keep pretending I wasn't being crushed under the weight of all the silence. My sleep became erratic, my appetite disappeared. I stopped answering even the people who loved me. I was disappearing into myself. The affair didn't just ruin relationships, it dismantled my sense of integrity. I felt like a stranger in my own skin. I couldn't journal anymore because I hated the words I was writing. I avoided mirrors. I tried to bury myself in work, in distractions, in meaningless conversation. But every quiet moment brought it all back. I was complicit in someone else's betrayal. I had helped fracture something sacred, and I couldn't stop picturing Naomi's face, the warmth she used to have when she'd hug me, how she used to say I was the only one she trusted with everything. That trust had been currency, and I'd spent it like it was mine. Then came the inevitable moment I had been dreading. Naomi found the messages. I don't know exactly how, but I had been careless. Maybe it was one of those nights he left his phone open, or a cloud backup, or just intuition. She didn't scream, she didn't cry in front of me. She just sent one message: "You broke something I can't fix." That was all. The silence that followed was louder than any fight could have been. Jake went radio silent. Deleted his social media. Naomi blocked me on everything. I lost both of them in one day, and in that emptiness, the weight of everything I had done came crashing down. Not just the affair, but the loneliness that led me there. The family I still hadn't spoken to. The version of myself I had slowly let die in exchange for borrowed affection. In the days that followed, I felt hollow. I walked around like a ghost, functioning, smiling when needed, but dead behind the eyes. I stopped talking to almost everyone. I felt like I had nothing left to say that wouldn't expose more of the wreckage I was trying to hide. The worst part wasn't losing Jake, or even Naomi. The worst part was realizing how far I had gone just to feel loved, and how much destruction I had accepted as collateral damage in the process. The silence after everything fell apart wasn't just external. It was internal, suffocating, the kind that settles in your bones. Naomi had cut me off completely, and rightly so. Jake disappeared, vanished into some distant part of his life I no longer had access to. I thought that would be the end of it. That maybe, after the heartbreak and fallout, I could close the door and move on. But it doesn't work like that. Not when you've been emotionally intimate with someone you were never supposed to touch. Not when the betrayal involves more than one person. The emotional debris doesn't just vanish, it lingers. And I had to live in it. I couldn't escape the mirror. Every day I looked at myself, and I didn't recognize the woman staring back. I saw someone who had betrayed her best friend, compromised her values, and destroyed a relationship that once felt like family. But more than that, I saw a woman who had completely lost herself in the desperate pursuit of emotional safety. I hadn't just wanted Jake's attention. I wanted to be chosen, heard, needed. But the moment it all collapsed, I realized I had traded my self-respect for fleeting validation. My parents found out eventually. News like that travels in families. Whispers behind closed doors. Bits of conversation that leak between siblings. I hadn't spoken to them since the retreat, but now my phone buzzed with a single message from my mother. "We're disappointed. You know better." That was it. No questions, no understanding. Just another reminder that I was the black mark on their carefully curated image of a perfect family. I was the daughter who didn't get invited, and now I was the one who'd given them a reason to say, "See, this is why." For days I didn't leave the house. I turned my phone off. I deleted photos. I blocked Jake, even though he hadn't contacted me since. And for a while, I let myself sink. Not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet ways women are conditioned to self-destruct, through guilt, through silence, through carrying the emotional weight of everyone else's pain. I replayed every moment, every message, every time I could have stopped but didn't. I kept thinking, if I had just gone somewhere else that weekend, if I hadn't answered that first message, if I had felt more secure in myself. But life doesn't give you rewinds. It gives you echoes. And they followed me everywhere. The hardest part wasn't losing people. It was sitting in the aftermath with myself. I couldn't call Naomi and say sorry. It wouldn't fix anything. I couldn't ask Jake for closure. It wasn't his to give. And my parents, their silence said enough, so I started going inward, peeling back every layer of what had led me to that place, not to justify it, but to understand it. The rejection from my family didn't start with the retreat. It started years earlier in little ways that accumulated. Missed calls, unspoken disapproval being compared to my siblings. The loneliness didn't come out of nowhere. It had roots and they ran deep. Therapy helped, not right away, but eventually. I sat in front of a woman who didn't flinch when I told her the truth. I expected judgment. Instead, she asked me, "When did you stop believing you were worthy without someone else's attention?" That question broke me open. I cried for an hour, not just because of Jake or Naomi, but because I realized I had been searching for love in places where it would always be conditional. I had accepted crumbs because I believed that's all I was allowed to have. And once I started to see that, the shame didn't disappear, but it started to shift. It became something I could work with. I began rebuilding, not my friendships or family ties, not yet, but my relationship with myself. I started writing again, not pretty, polished things, but raw, unfiltered thoughts. I let myself sit with discomfort instead of numbing it. I stopped running from mirrors. I let myself be honest, brutally so. I wasn't the villain, but I wasn't innocent either. I was a woman who made a mess out of pain. A woman who needed to fall that far to understand the importance of boundaries, of integrity, of self, worth that isn't tied to someone else's gaze. One day, months later, I walked past the cabin where the family retreats used to happen. It was locked, quiet, untouched since summer. I stood there for a while, remembering how I once thought that space was the key to feeling whole again. But now I understood it was never about the cabin. It was about being accepted. And maybe I didn't get that from them, but I could give it to myself. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed anyone to choose me. I was finally learning to choose myself, not in spite of the pain, but because of it.